Attendance figures from the Indiana Fever's recent home stretch have become a talking point among fans and observers, with visibly emptier sections during a matchup that, in past seasons, would have been a guaranteed sellout. The contrast didn't go unnoticed. Lower bowl seating filled out as expected, but upper deck sections that are typically packed when Caitlin Clark takes the floor showed noticeably sparse crowds, prompting speculation across fan forums and social media about what's driving the shift. There's no official explanation from the organization for the dip, and any single cause would be speculation. But the timing lines up with a stretch of the season defined by frustration with officiating, with the handling of player safety, and with a string of incidents that fans feel haven't been addressed with the seriousness they deserve. The most discussed of those incidents remains the foul committed by Alyssa Thomas, which resulted in her suspension. The play, which involved contact to Clark's neck and shoulder area, was reviewed by the league and resulted in a one-game suspension for Thomas, a punishment that drew immediate and vocal criticism from fans and commentators who felt it didn't match the severity of the act caught on camera. Replays circulated widely, and the discourse around the incident hasn't faded in the week since. For a significant portion of the fan base, the suspension read as inadequate given what the footage showed, and that sense of disproportionate consequence has fed into a broader narrative. The league's protection of its players, and specifically of its biggest draw, has been inconsistent at best. That frustration hasn't stayed isolated to a single incident. It's become tangled up with ongoing criticism of head coach Stephanie White, whose in-game decisions have drawn scrutiny from a fan base that has grown increasingly vocal over the course of the season. Specific complaints have centered on late-game rotations, the offensive sets run in close contests, and a perceived reluctance to adjust strategy in response to repeated patterns of physical play directed at Clark. Whether or not those criticisms are fair is a matter of ongoing debate among fans and analysts, but the volume and consistency of the complaints have become difficult to ignore. Comment sections under recent game recaps and highlight clips have skewed heavily toward dissatisfaction, not just with individual losses, but with what many viewers describe as a pattern of passive coaching in moments that call for adjustments. The Thomas suspension and the coaching criticism have started to merge into a single storyline for a lot of fans, a sense that the people responsible for protecting and developing the team's most marketable player haven't done enough, whether that's the league office handling supplemental discipline or the coaching staff managing rotations and in-game adjustments. That sentiment shows up repeatedly in fan reaction. Even when the specific complaints differ from person to person, it's worth separating what's documented from what's interpretation here. The suspension happened. The play that caused it is on video and has been broken down extensively. The criticism of White's rotations and play calling is also documented, in the sense that it's a consistent and recurring theme in fan and media commentary throughout the season. What's less certain is the direct causal link between any of this and the attendance numbers from a single game. Attendance can be affected by a long list of factors: scheduling, weather, ticket pricing, competing local events, and attributing a dip entirely to fan dissatisfaction without attendance data trends across multiple games would be reading more into a single data point than it can support. What can be said with more confidence is that the public conversation around the team has shifted noticeably over the past several weeks. Much of the goodwill that defined the start of the season, when the Fever's games were treated as must-watch events built around Clark's presence, has been replaced by a more critical tone. Fans who once showed up primarily to see a generational talent are now spending as much time discussing officiating decisions, league discipline, and coaching choices as they are discussing the basketball itself. Part of that shift traces back to how the Thomas incident was handled publicly. League disciplinary decisions are typically followed by some explanation of the process, and in this case, the explanation did little to quiet the criticism. Many fans pointed to the disparity between what was visible on tape and the length of the suspension as evidence that the review process wasn't taking the safety of players seriously enough, particularly when the player on the receiving end of the contact happens to be the league's most visible figure. That perception, regardless of whether it reflects the actual internal reasoning behind the league's decision, has become a fixture of the conversation. The criticism of White's coaching runs along a parallel but related track. Where the Thomas suspension speaks to questions of player safety and league accountability, the coaching criticism speaks to questions of strategy and protection on a more granular level. How rotations are managed when a star player is drawing extra physical attention, how late-game possessions are designed, and how much trust is placed in alternative scoring options when Clark is being targeted. Fans frustrated by the Thomas incident have, in many cases, extended that frustration to the coaching staff, arguing that game management hasn't adapted to account for the pattern of physical play directed at the team's centerpiece. None of this exists in a vacuum. The Fever have been one of the most watched teams in the league this season, and that visibility means every decision, disciplinary, tactical, or organizational, gets amplified well beyond what a typical regular season storyline would receive. The volume of scrutiny on White, on the league office, and on the broader handling of Clark's treatment on the floor reflects that visibility as much as it reflects the substance of any individual decision. Where this leaves the team going forward is an open question. The on-court product hasn't changed dramatically in terms of results, but the surrounding narrative has shifted from anticipation to scrutiny. Fans who built their viewing habits around a single transformative season are now processing a string of controversies that have, fairly or not, become as central to the team's story as the games themselves. Whether that translates into a lasting shift in attendance or engagement is something that would require more sustained data than any single game can offer. What's clear is that the emotional temperature around the team has changed, and the next several weeks, both on the court and in how the organization responds to ongoing criticism, are likely to shape whether that shift is temporary or something more lasting. The broader context for all of this sits inside a season that has been defined, more than anything, by a tension between visibility and protection. Clark's arrival reshaped scheduling, television placement, and ticket demand across the league almost overnight, and that shift created expectations that extended well past her own team. Opposing arenas built promotional pushes around her appearances. Broadcast partners adjusted coverage plans to follow the Fever more closely than any team in recent league history. That level of attention also raised the stakes around how she's officiated and how she's protected on the floor, since any perceived lapse becomes a story in itself rather than a routine basketball moment. That dynamic is part of why the Thomas incident resonated as strongly as it did. It wasn't simply a hard foul during a contested game. It became a referendum on whether the infrastructure around the league, officiating crews, the disciplinary review process, coaching staffs across the league, has caught up to the reality of having a player whose health is now tied directly to the financial trajectory of the entire business. Fans who voiced frustration aren't only reacting to a single suspension length, they're reacting to a sense that the systems meant to manage this new level of attention haven't adjusted quickly enough. Within the Fever's own locker room, that tension shows up differently. Players like Sophie Cunningham have been vocal, on the record, about wanting more physical accountability extended toward Clark, framing it as a basic competitive fairness issue rather than special treatment. Aaliyah Boston and Kelsey Mitchell have had to manage their own roles inside a team where most of the outside conversation orbits around one player's treatment, which adds a layer of complexity to how the locker room processes each new controversy. None of that is new information this season, but it forms the backdrop against which any single incident, including the Thomas suspension, gets interpreted. On the coaching side, White inherited a roster built around a player whose gravitational pull on opposing game plans is unlike anything most coaches have had to design around. Opposing teams frequently send extra bodies at Clark, both defensively and, fans argue, physically. Adjusting rotations, late-game sets, and timeout management to account for that pattern is a genuinely difficult coaching problem, and reasonable people can disagree about whether White's approach has met that challenge. What's measurable is the public response, a season-long undercurrent of criticism that has grown louder with each new flashpoint, of which the Thomas suspension was simply the most recent and most visible. Taken together, the picture that emerges isn't one of a single bad week or a single controversial decision. It's a cumulative effect, incident after incident, criticism after criticism, that has worn down some of the early season optimism and replaced it with a more guarded, more critical fan base. Whether the organization, the coaching staff, or the league office responds in a way that addresses those concerns directly will likely shape how much of that goodwill can be rebuilt over the back half of the season.